cell phone or your laptop, if you can turn the notifications off, the sound, that would be helpful. Thank you. There you go. The others are right beside you. Yes. Yeah, I see it. Here you are. Commissioners, Chief Commissioner, I would like to introduce the next witness that I'm calling today, the Honorable Kim Bowden. I'll have one question before I actually have you promised in. You go by, is it okay if I call you Kim?
Yes.
Wonderful. Mr. Registrar, Kim would like to promise in on an eagle feather, please.
Here I am. Good morning, Mr. Bowden. Do you promise to tell your truth in a good way today?
I do.
Thank you.
We're just going to get an adjustment here.
Thanks.
Thank you. So Kim, I just wanted to start with a couple questions about your background, but my first question is, you're the Honorable Kim Bowden. Why is that?
When I was named to the as a Justice of the Peace, the Crown gives you that designation, and one thing that you learn is that they can never take that away from you. So I don't use it all the time, only in my kids.
Excellent, but you're okay if I call you the Commissioner or the parties withstanding, just refer to you as Kim?
Oh yes.
So Kim, one of the things I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about your background. So if we can start with you sharing with us just a little bit about your background, as comfortable as you are sharing with us.
Well, I come from a very large family. I have a status card. I'm a part of a general ban list in Alberta. My original reserve was the Michelle Reserve. It was the only band in Canada to be enfranchised in the 20th century, and that happened in 1958. On my father's side, I'm actually a Red River Métis as well, and you know, I was thinking about this when the question was being posed, is that, you know, I have roots in Quebec, Manitoba, Alberta, and of course Saskatchewan, and so the number of relations that I have, and I quite honestly I can tell you I almost feel like I meet them each and every day. I get calls, people call me and say, I think I'm related to you, and they usually are. So it's been quite a journey for myself.
I also understand that you're currently the National Vice Chief with the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. Can you just tell us a little bit about what that role entails?
Yeah, I'm one of half of the executive. There's the National Chief and then Vice Chief. And yeah, I was voted in 2 years ago in 2016. It was part of a larger journey because I was the president of the Aboriginal Affairs Coalition of Saskatchewan for a number of years. So I've been involved with the Congress of Aboriginal People for probably 13 years now. And prior to that, I was actually involved with them as a youth as well, or youth. Some people call it that. I don't want to date myself, but yeah, I've been involved in that for a long time. Now my role in terms of I'm gonna put two hats on here. My understanding today. No pun intended, because I like to wear a hat. My role in terms of the Vice Chief is to advocate for off-reserve Indigenous people in this country, and we've been in an advocate organization since 1971, and we've had a number of great leaders come through our organization. The one that had the most impact on me was Mr. Jim Sinclair, the late Jim Sinclair. And he's the one that ensured that Métis people were affirmed in the Constitution of Canada. And of course, then we just had a ruling, a couple of years ago as well, with respect to Daniels versus the Crown, where Indigenous or non-status and Métis people were under 9124 of the Constitution. So these were huge rulings, and that was a Supreme Court ruling. And it was very important to the movement for our people in Canada, Indigenous people.
And in that same line, the Congress of Aboriginal People, for those who, a lot of us do know what they do and who they are, can you just give us a little bit of information about what the Congress of Aboriginal People as an organization is and what they do?
Well, we advocate for Métis and non-status Indians. I'm going to say we are, we used to use the term the forgotten people in this country, because a lot of times that we were forgotten, and we went to bat for a number of issues throughout the years. One really good example would be under Bill C-31. We're the one that brought the issue forward with respect to the discrimination within the Indian Act. We had the provision under Section 67 as well in the Human Rights Act to have that removed because it impacted Indigenous women who were living on reserve. We were behind that. We were actually the first organization to really go after the Indian Act because of the fact that we believed, in terms of a policy or an act itself, that it handcuffed our people in this country. And it had direct effect on people who did live off reserve, and it continues to happen today. And a lot of us that sit around the table, we are treaty people. People have status cards. They sign treaties with the government, formal treaties. And a lot of the times we have to fight tooth and nail to ensure that those treaties are honored. And that's the kind of work that we do and what we advocate for as a national organization. Thank you.
If I could ask one more question in relation to the Congress of Aboriginal People, whose acronym is often CAP. If I can ask about, in terms of CAP, their advocacy as it relates to status and non-status in Métis peoples who live off reserve, is it fair to say that they've really kind of helped raise awareness around the disenfranchisement or the estrangement of Indigenous people from their traditional communities and homelands?
That would be a very fair statement to make. A lot of times there are, we've had to actually bring up issues with respect to ban policies with people who live on reserve and the impact that it's had on them. For example, the right to vote for your chief and council if you're living off reserve. That was something that we fought very hard for. And it's still that's still a work in progress as of today. Again, like I was saying before, we wanted to ensure that human rights applied to on reserve, because we would hear stories from particularly Indigenous women who their lives would be impacted if there is an issue with respect to their partner or their families, and they would actually be asked to leave that reserve and move out. And this would impact them and their children. And we wanted to fight for them because it wasn't fair. And so that's kind of work that Congress does do.
And is it fair to say that CAP's it's not just an advocacy, but it's also sometimes seen as sort of like a political organization of sorts?
Yes, that would certainly be fair to say. Again, since 1971, we've looked at numerous policies that the federal government has come up with, and really thrown in our face, and as Indigenous people, and a lot of these policies affect us, dramatically, whether you're living on or off reserve, and we want to ensure that our voice is heard and that we're at that table. And one thing too that politics is pretty ugly out there right now, and there's an election coming up, so we're looking forward to that as a national organization to certainly get our policies across with respect to off-reserve Indigenous people in this country.
So you talked about the one hat. Let's talk about the other hat. What's the other hat you're wearing here today?
I'm actually a outreach worker with a program called Straight Up in Saskatoon. It's 10,000 Steps to Healing, and it's a program designed to keep people out of gangs in Saskatoon. And I can give you a bit of history. The program began about 17 years ago. The founding person by the name of Father Andre, we call him Father Andre, he was approached by some people who were in gangs and said, you know, we've had enough of living this kind of lifestyle and we need to get out. And we need to figure out how we can do that and who we can work with to do that. And Father Andre, you know, stepped up and said, you know, I'm willing to help out. And he would have numerous meetings. We call them meetings in the parking lot of Tim Hortons, because that's sort of where his office was at the time. Now, we are not a federally funded program. We never have been. We rely on donations, and we rely on sort of grant funding. Sometimes they'll get a program, you know, they'll come in, it'll keep you going for, you know, a few months, you know, that kind of thing. And so as of today, I mean, we've been working with both the federal government and the province, but I want to use the term platitudes and gratitudes is basically where we've gotten today. We haven't moved that forward as much as we want to. About a few months ago, we had a meeting, or excuse me, a symposium on a gang program, a strategy. We wanted a provincial gang strategy. And that report should be coming out, I believe, in November. And and it's all community driven. The only thing I want to stress, this is not from the top down. A lot of our members that are involved with Straight Up drive this program. These are their ideas. It comes from the community. It comes from them, from the grassroots. So I could say that this is certainly a grassroots perspective on the program itself. And I could talk a lot. I'm hoping I'm not talking too fast, but I can certainly tell a lot of stories that we've learned. And one thing is when I put my other hat on as National Vice Chief, this program has really kept me grounded as a elected official or somebody who's been elected to a national office because of the struggles that people face. And so that's one thing that certainly has benefited me when I address issues that impact the people, particularly in the justice system as well. And this is why this forum here that I'm at is very, very important. And I don't think I mentioned this, I'm very honored to be here and share my knowledge and information.
Thanks, Kim. I noticed in the package, in the materials that you provide us, that you have a curriculum vitae. There's highlights of your qualification right at the beginning. And I see, and you'd agree with me, that you have over 16 years experience as a program coordinator in recreational and correction settings.
Yes.
And that you also have 5 years working in mental health field, 10 years working in the justice field, 5 years as a Justice of the Peace Level 2. I want to stop there and I want to ask you, what is a Level 2 Justice of the Peace and what do they do?
What happens is that prior to taking the role on as a Justice of Peace, you have to go through a training component in terms of the system itself, the judiciary system, how it works, how the courts work. And it was quite a learning experience. It gives you an opportunity how you address the Crown, for example, how you address people who are advocating on behalf of people who've been, brought up on charges, the accused. Those are the kind of training that they offer you. And plus the other issue, of course, important is the criminal code itself. It's quite it's like a crash course in a sense. And yeah, again, it's a lot of work, but you learn a lot through the process. And so I found it really informative and a very good learning experience for myself.
As a justice of the peace at level 2, would you preside over things like bail hearings?
Yes, you would. There's been, I would say that based on my experience going through that, one of the things that I used to do is I noticed, particularly with the Crown, who I'm not sure people know this, but across Canada, the court system itself, particularly after hours, there's no provision in the criminal code that allows a police officer to act as the Crown, but within Canada they do that, and that was brought up in Alberta. So what happens is that when you're addressing when you're presiding, you actually are addressing the police officer who's actually the Crown, who is also wearing 2-3 hats. So they arrest, then they're there as the prosecution, then they're also there as the Crown, and they're there in those sort of areas. And it's to me, it's not a really good process to be involved in terms of the police departments and police forces across Canada, because it puts our people at a disadvantage. There's no question about it. A lot of times they don't have access to justice within the system, and yeah, you're already up against the wall.
I noticed that one thing that's not on your CV, Kim, is that you also currently have an appointment to the Federal Judicial Advisory Committee.
Yes. Well, that process, I'm a community appointed member to the Justice Committee, Advisory Committee. And what that does is that it gives us an opportunity to have input when people apply to become a sitting justice. And my areas in particular to Saskatchewan. What I really like about it is I remember a number of years ago, and I sort of did some research on it, is that a lot of times they were political appointments. So in other words, the party who was in power at the time, if you knew somebody and you got along with them and you were a lawyer and you decided to apply to become a judge, the chances are pretty good that you would get appointed to that sitting. And however, today, what's happened is that the government has changed the process where community people, there are lawyers involved as well as a judge, that they get to have some input into who those people will be chosen to sit on the bench. And being that it could be a long-term one, I find it very extensive and very, when they follow the process in terms of picking a judge, we really dig down in terms of the background of that particular person. And we certainly find out a lot. My role sitting there, and I bring this role to the table, is that I look at people who apply to the extent of what their knowledge was when in terms of Indigenous people in this country. Do they know anything about it? I mean, we hear stories today that some of the judges don't even know who Métis people are, for example. And that tells you a lot about our education system when they have no idea who Métis people are. So these are important things that when a person applies to the judiciary, that they should have that background. One thing too and I'm really hoping this is going to happen down the road, maybe not, but I mean, we've had a couple people who, a few people who've, expressed interest. We want Indigenous people, of course, to apply, and we also, of course, want women, and we're hoping that within time that this will change. Maybe in time the whole court process will change in Canada, and we'll have our own First Nations Indigenous court for all the provinces. Maybe that's sort of my idea, but that's another thing. But yeah, it's very, very. I like the process. It's really relevant to what we're doing.
And just so that I'm clear, your role in this process, you don't actually get to determine who would be appointed, but you get to provide input from community perspective as part of sort of a larger process. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, and we recommend. And what happens is it's up to the minister to either approve that or choose not to approve it. But we do recommend. We put the names forward, and we hope that that's the case. So, but yeah, it's better than the process they had before. So,
Chief Commissioner, I'm sorry, I've tried to promote you yet again. It's because we're talking about the justice system. Chief Commissioner, Commissioners, I would kindly ask that we make Kimberly Joseph Bowden's curriculum vitae an exhibit.
Yes, Mr. Bowden's CV is Exhibit 20, please.
I'm presenting Mr. Bowden as an institutional witness today in the two hats that he's described, one as the Vice President of CAP, but the other as frontline worker in a number of, in particularly the justice and corrections field. But I would ask that the commissioners allow him to provide opinion specifically on the Straight Up, and that's spelled STR number 8 space UP Straight Up program, being that he has had the years of experience as frontline and particularly as outreach and working with prior gang members, and will be able to provide opinion on this particular program. I'm going to look out and see if any of the parties withstanding has any objections in relation to Mr. Bowden providing opinion on the Straight Up program. And seeing no objections, I would ask that you kindly make a determination on my request.
Yes, certainly on the evidence, Mr. Bowden has the required experience, education, and training to give opinion evidence on this Straight Up program. Thank you.
Thank you. And so we've already kind of covered a lot of some of your background and your experience with the justice system, but I want to take a step back because when you were first describing to us your background, you talked about the fact that you're from the Shell community, and you talked about the fact that that entire community was disenfranchised in the 50s. What impact has coming from a community that has experienced that type of disenfranchisement had on you in your professional capacity or in sort of all of the steps and community actions you take moving forward?
well, you know, when I was younger, my cookum and my mother would share stories with our family about the reserve. I didn't really know a lot about it. I knew that it was situated outside St. Albert, Alberta. It was 40 square miles. I knew that the federal government had stepped in, gave people a little bit of money, and told everybody to get out. And not everybody benefited from that in terms of the reserve. What I found, you know, years later is that it had a huge impact on our families. There was at the time, there was 750 people who were registered to that reserve at that time. And by doing that, you know, one of the things that had happened too is that the federal government, this had been under Diefenbaker, they wanted to implement this policy because they wanted to, it was going to be a template to take out all the reserves in Canada at that time. And they realized that under the Bill of Rights, you know, formerly it was called the Bill of Rights at that time, now the Charter, that it would not work. So once they got, when they enfranchised the reserve, the Michelle people and the Calahoo people, they stopped right there. And but you know what it's done though is that it divided a people, it divided families, and like I was saying earlier, I mean, I still meet people who are related to me that I didn't even know, first cousins, people coming up to you and, I'm your cousin. Speaking of that, I'm going to bring up a woman here that had gone missing from our family. Her name was Stella Violet Callahoo. She was born April 17, 1947. She would have been my second cousin and my mother's first cousin. She disappeared in the 80s, and my cousin was telling me yesterday that they had hired a private detective just to find out what happened to her. We never did. She was last seen in Prince George, British Columbia. The relations believe that she was caught up in the Highway of Tears, and she left 3 kids. And so, again, we're all touched by some of the things that have happened in terms of government policies and that affect our people.
And one of the things you had said when you introduced yourself, and I know a lot of people in the room will know this, but keeping in mind, there may be people also watching on the webcast that aren't familiar. You said, well, I'm a status Indian. So you actually are registered as an Indian under the Indian Act, despite the fact that the Michelle band was totally enfranchised. How and why did that happen?
The first process happened in 1985, where the federal government, when Bill C-31 came along, they had to register everybody that was part of that band. So yeah, there was 750 people. The second process was in 2010 under Bill C-3, and that's where I come in with my status card. I'm an 838 number. That's a term that they like to use. We call ourselves 838 people, but just kind of goofy term. But anyways, and again, with this new bill that's actually coming out under S3, the Senate bill, we believe that there'll also be another increase of people because the Indian Act itself was racist, it was discriminatory. I found out that my grandfather as well had a status card. He was enfranchised in 1928 from the same reserve, and they considered him white. Yet the guy, I know he spoke Cree. He actually even spoke Michif, and so I found that kind of interesting. But I remember all these policies had a direct impact on all of us in terms of our whole family on my mother's end. So it was quite interesting. And one thing I want to stress too is that as a Indigenous person myself, I did not learn any of this stuff until I was in my early 20s. I started to learn because I had the opportunity to go to Gabriel Dumont Institute in Regina, Saskatchewan, and learn a bit about who I was. I had no idea. The education system failed us in this country, right? And we were taught to hate ourselves as people. Sorry. Anyways. I remember Jim Sinclair. He was defending Mr. Haneke, and he said that, and he was dead on. He said that the education system failed us. They taught us to hate each other. They taught us to hate who we were. And so today, as of today, I'm still learning who I am, and I'm proud to say who I am. Where before I would have ran away.
Thank you, Kim. I think that actually helps segue us a little into the youth you're working with now and the former gang members you're working with now, because in the context of Indigenous people being disenfranchised or sometimes seeking identity, I understand that some of the work you're doing within Straight Up is to put cultural values, to allow opportunities to learn about Indigenous cultures and communities so that there's a place for either exiting gang members or youth that are at risk to find some strength within culture. So could you tell us a little bit more about Straight Up and the program itself?
Well, Straight Up is really, if you drill down in terms of the program itself, it is a healing journey for the members who were in gangs. And that's what we really strive for, because a lot of times, a lot of the members that come through the program, they're disconnected to their culture, they're disconnected to spirituality, they're disconnected to the communities, their families. They got involved in something that really, when they share their stories with you, what I found is that they think that gang life is a family, and it's not. But what Straight Up offers is we give them that family that they've never had, and that's what we do. It's very important. We strive for that, and we will never, we do everything we can not to forget about the members and new people who come in who've really have had enough of living that kind of lifestyle. You know, more of it too is that I found I even learned a lot. For example, the role, there's single parent families, of course, quite a few, but there's also single parent fathers as well who've actually taken that role and taken a parent role, which you never would even thought of. Like, you never thought that this would happen, but it does. It's because they've reinstilled those values and those traditional thinking, and it's really benefited them as they move forward. And there are different stages that ex-gang members go through. Some people ask, some really pertinent questions, tough questions, like how do you exit out of a gang life? How do you get out? We have a fairly good relationship in Saskatoon with people, actually the gangs that are in there now, that they are well aware of Straight Up, and there's that a respect, that I'll use the term respect. A number of years ago, there certainly wasn't. If somebody wanted to exit, they would, they would get minutes. I don't know if you guys heard the term minutes before, but basically they would get beat up. It didn't matter whether you're a guy or a woman, you'd get your, kicked in, punched out, that kind of stuff, if you wanted to leave. And as of today, that hasn't happened as much. Even sometimes, and of course, there are brothers and sisters that are, have relations. And I want to talk about that a little bit as well. That when you get out of when you make that decision to leave the gang life, you also make a decision to leave your family. And when I say we're talking your brothers, your sisters, sometimes even your parents, because that's not the kind of, they recognize that they don't want to be part of that, and it's a tough one. It's a very tough decision for them to make. And so with Straight Up itself, that's why we offer that family. We give them that hope, and that they'll continue. And there are a number of people that are become quite very good advocates for people in the justice system, or within, for ex-gang members. And like, we just recently had a somebody graduated from social work. He's from Hobima, and he just recently graduated, and it was unbelievable the struggles this guy had to deal with just to get his degree in social work, and running to the food bank and stuff to eat. And there's one thing I will say this too, is that our education system, Stacy, he couldn't even find funding to go to school. His band turned him down. It was a complete struggle. He had to take a student loan. So I don't know where that comes from, that all Indigenous people get their school paid for, because that's certainly not the case. And so he struggled. I'm sure he ate a lot of bologna sandwiches and macaroni dinner, Kraft dinner and stuff. And And but today he did graduate, a few months ago. We've got other people right now that are presently in school. Some people are doing upgrading. Some people are taking technical training. Be mechanics. They want to take training with regards to helping their people as well. For example, in addictions is one that people are striving for. So a lot of times, the members, they'll tell me that, hey, my life is, I haven't done anything or I haven't gone anywhere. And, I always tell them, just you've taken 10,000 steps. And sure, you might go backwards, but you'll continue. You've moved way further ahead than you can ever imagine. So that's the kind of the impact that this program has had on people's lives. It's gotten so much too that we've had so many calls from different provinces to adopt those same principles, that vision that we have as an organization across Canada. And because again, when I'm not sure if I missed this as well, but when I say traditional, our elders are involved and knowledge keepers and the people that are important to the lives of the members itself. And one thing too is that not everybody within the Straight Up program is Indigenous. We do have non-Indigenous people there as well. And again, but it's a family. Number one, we're a family, we're a healing journey. And we always go back to that when we, if the program were to, I would just use the term run out of money because we don't really have a lot of money. We would still continue on based on the volunteers that we have and the people who believe in what we're doing as an organization and what we could do to impact Canada as well. So, yeah.
So if I can take a step back, because the program sounds really good and strong in terms of how it recenters people, but if I can maybe if we can set some concepts that might be helpful. So if I understand, the program actually accepts like exiting gang members. That's true, right? But it also provides programming for risk at youth to being put into gangs or going into gangs. One of the things that you had said earlier is, a choice for exiting gang members or avoiding gang is often they have to choose exiting over their families. And it's a tough conversation, but it's a reality in Canada. A lot of it stems from the criminal justice system itself, but Indigenous gangs specifically in this country, we know that there's pockets of them in various urban centers, and I know there's a lot of reasons, and we can dig and talk about how they derive or how there's connection to corrections. But just so that we, for the purposes of our conversation in your program, is it fair to say that the proliferation of gangs in Indigenous communities often does involve generations or relations? And when I say generations and relations, you made a reference to, the gang might even be your family. So in some communities, it's where there is gangs, it's not uncommon to see siblings, cousins, and potentially even parents all belonging to a particular gang.
Yeah, that would certainly be fair to say. Ground zero for gangs in this country began in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And I noticed you mentioned it earlier, my work experience with the city of Saskatoon as a program consultant. Well, one of the things that I was sort of the go-to person when it came to the pulse of the community, particularly the pulse of the Indigenous community in Saskatoon. In the early 90s, we knew that gangs were going to take hold in Saskatoon. And we approached the city administration at that time, and we said we need to come up with a plan and a strategy, because this is happening. This is going to take hold in this city. And we were met with the deer in the headlights look. They didn't know how to address it. The administration didn't know how to address it. I tried to bring it up even further up the line in terms of even some of the city council members there as well, but it just didn't happen. And I believe, that we could have done something at that time that maybe it wouldn't be, as bad. But Then it started to evolve. I mean, it hit Regina, of course, Saskatoon, North Battleford, all those major urban areas in Saskatchewan. And we, you know, for example, the Congress of Aboriginal People, we put a resolution on the floor in 2007 to set up a national gang strategy, a commission, and that was passed by the annual General Assembly, the delegates. And it was a policy that we felt it was really important and that it could go right across this country, because we knew the worst areas, for example, was North Central in Regina, Saskatchewan. That was unbelievable, the impact that gangs did have on the community there. And it just kept feeding out and feeding out. And the reason I want to bring that up is because I just believe that, you know, sometimes we know something's going to happen. We have the intel or the information, and yet we did not react to it. And we should have, as a community, as a people. Now we're, you know, again, we want to, in terms of the youth, that's one thing, is that that's one of the pressing areas with respect to our program as well, youth. We do hundreds and hundreds of presentations, and we try to focus in on particularly the youth in Saskatoon, the schools, the high schools, even elementaries, you know, it's up grade 6, for example, to explain to them, have the members, and the members tell their story. That's who tells their story. The members will share with them, this is not Hollywood, this is not the kind of lifestyle that you want to go down. And that's a message that we clearly spell out to our youth, our Indigenous youth. They need to know that. They need to hear the real stories of our members, our ex-members and ex-gang members, because that really hits home when you hear that directly coming from them and the type of lifestyle. And nobody wants to go into that, really, because it adversely affects, and youth are the big one. It's really important for us to strive in terms of protecting our youth, because that's the way I look at it as well. It's a protection of our youth to ensure that they hear these stories. Remember, as Indigenous people, we were really good at sharing our stories, and I find that has the biggest impact.
And so, and it wasn't my intent to make this big gross generalization that there is, that it's always family or relational, but I thought it was important to put that out there. But I think it's also important to recognize, and I know you brought this up, and we heard from our other panelists today, a lot of it is driven by things we already know, like poverty, like colonial legacy. So people entering into gangs sometimes out of necessity in order to not just within the family relationships, but just to survive and sustain. So let's talk about breaking down the myths of how people get involved in gangs. Because often I think, like you had mentioned, the Hollywood version, people immediately assume that it's like a shoot 'em bang up, that people are going into gangs because they just want to be a badass gangster. But the reality is a lot of people that find themselves in gangs are coming from a place of poverty, where they're lacking essential services, where they don't have the supports that are required. And if you could give us a little bit of that background, I think it would be helpful.
Yes, poverty would be the biggest one, that when they get involved in gangs in general, it is because of lack of housing, poverty, of course. Lack of food. They struggle to feed their kids. These are the kind of things that have a spiraling effect, a negative effect on themselves. And then, of course, when you're getting involved in addiction issues, for example, it's a vicious circle. And addiction is, for example, is a huge issue amongst our members. They struggle with that quite a bit. Most of them are dealing with that, of course. But when those things come into play, then it leads to other things, right? I mean, you're leading into prostitution, for example, and of course, your crime in terms of selling drugs and that. I mean, these are all these negative things that come into play because of the fact that there's no sustainability within their home or their family. And yeah, it's tough. I mean, there's again, like I was saying, some of the stories that I hear them probably every day of some of the struggles that our members deal with. When I started I'll tell you, when I started work 3.5 years ago, one thing about the members, they like to tease you, when you're taking them to their meetings, probation officer meetings, or you're going to court to advocate for them. I remember 3.5 years ago, I had gained about 20 pounds now, and one of the members said, "That's because you're eating your feelings." I sort of laughed. It's probably true. But we tease each other because, of course, as Indigenous people, we have to laugh. We have to have a sense of humor because sometimes life is tough out there. But yeah, all these factors come into play. I mean, we had a strategic plan with regards to Straight Up a few months ago, and one of the questions somebody had asked is, where do you envision Straight Up 20 years from now, 30 years from now? And I said, really, I'm hoping that Straight Up is no more. And well, why would that? It's because then we've addressed gang issues in this province and Saskatoon, and that we don't need the program now. And that program now will move to education, traditional teachings, those kind of things. And so that's my idea, down the road. But I'm hoping the Creator will bless us that will be down the road, that we won't have to talk about gangs and those negative things anymore. So anyways, that's sort of, I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. If I could get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of the actual program, and I know it sounds fairly simple, but I'd just like to kind of walk through potentially sort of what a member would be experiencing. I understand that the program, and you had said earlier yourself, this was really driven by gang members themselves, the need to create this program. But what if someone is trying to exit and you're the outreach worker? What are some of the first steps, and then what are they involved in when they sort of join Straight Up? So an exiting gang member's first interaction with you looks like what?
Well, a lot of times our members, they come out of corrections or they'll come out of our federal prisons. Amazingly, we will meet them right at the front line. They don't even have ID, for example. A lot of them don't have ID. They don't have they don't have any money. Sometimes they don't even have money to even catch a bus when they get out. And what I found too is that a lot of the people that come out, they've actually spent the majority of their time within the system. So in other words, if they were given 3 years, they've spent 3 years in there. They're not let out, an early release or anything like that. And so they'll come out. We link them up with different, like for example, housing is a big issue. We have to link them up with that to ensure that they have a place to stay, so they're not living couch surfing or living in the street. We do that. Sometimes, and then the other issue is, of course, health issues. Like to ensure that we get them linked up with doctors and dental issues as well, dentists. And of course, then they want to come out and they want to see their people that they haven't seen in a few years. So those are the first basic things that we do right away, is to ensure that we come up with a plan, game plan with them, like a case plan, and because we want to sort of lead them through what the immediate needs are, the intermediate needs are, and the long-term vision. And one thing that I really want to point out is that the government seems to think that, if you send people to corrections or if you send them to the federal penitentiary, that it's like they're working on addiction issues and that's not the case at all. They come out, that's a main thing, because all of a sudden a new world's in front of them, and yeah, they have to deal with their addiction issues. They didn't really necessarily deal with them when they were incarcerated. And a lot of people have post-traumatic stress disorder. Quite a few of our members have been isolated. You probably heard about that, for months and months, thrown in with nobody even knows where they are. And these are important things that people aren't even aware of. I mean, I could share a story that's public that anybody in here could look on the Google this person's name up, and you would know this guy's story. And it's unbelievable that the government has not provided the necessary resources for that, and then they wonder why people keep going back into the system all the time. In Saskatchewan, for example, they give you $460 a month to live, and that includes everything: food, shelter, clothing, for $460 a month. So if you come out and you're struggling, like, how can you live on $460 a month? Yet, they have no problem, forking out, $300 a day to keep people incarcerated. We'll talk about that a little bit in terms of the remand and all that kind of thing, but it's unbelievable that this is what we're dealing with. Sometimes in a lot of ways, I've lost faith in the system itself, the justice system, because it's just a system, and I heard that before, where the impact it has had on Indigenous people in this country is unbelievable. And of course, the percentages keep going up and up. I'll share you a little story. Last time I was in court, I watched a cookum who was looking after her grandchildren, and she was in court, and she was asking for to be let go, for bail hearing. And the judge asked her, "Why did you miss court?" And she said, "Well, I was looking after my grandchildren, and I had to pick my grandchildren ahead of the court system." And then the prosecutor stood up and said, "I oppose her release." So when you see that, and then I watched a non-Indigenous person just prior to that, had a record a mile long, was running from the justice system, running from the police, was basically on the run, had warrants out for his arrest, serious crimes. He had his family sitting in front there supporting him, and they released him. So you can see the two differences. It was quite, to me, I wasn't surprised, but of course that's Saskatchewan, and some people know that Saskatchewan's been in the news quite a bit, but that's an unfortunate thing. So our people, like our members and that's what we deal with each and every day when it comes to the justice system. And the reason I mentioned this other guy, this Curtis McKenzie, that's his name. He was in federal pen. The police, I believe, just kind of forcibly made him sign a Section 810, and he finished out all his term. So he finished everything. So what happened was they did let him out a bit earlier, about 4 months earlier. They let him go into a halfway house. He was having a hard time adjusting to the community. He ended up getting involved, unfortunately, with a relationship, and he ended up jumping into the river, into the Saskatchewan River. They had to fish him out. He didn't remember anything. I talked to this guy all the time. He was a good guy. When he was in the federal penitentiary, he was in solitary confinement for quite a long time, and he was telling me that he was going crazy. He had no contact, no human contact. They wouldn't allow him to write anything, books, story, like he couldn't write anything, any journaling, anything like that. He wouldn't even, and he told the people that he was going crazy in there, and he said, "Well, if I had something, I would, cut off my nose." Well, they handed him a sharp object, and he did just that. He cut off his nose. And once that happened, they released him right away. What I mean is he had to go to the hospital and stuff. Then they said, okay, we're going to let you out for good behavior, or whatever term they wanted to use. And then again, right after that, he ended up jumping into the river. Today, when I was talking about the 810, he signed that 810, and I don't know if people are aware of this, but this is one step under a dangerous offender designation. So I always advocate for our people, please do not sign that 810. It's a tool that's the police use. It's like they become the judge, the jury, and also they turn around and they can add on more time. In terms of the conditions that were put on, he breached that condition of no drinking, and now he's in Prince Albert Pen, spending another year, and I don't know how long. I don't even know how much time he's been in there, but it's going to be over a year now because he was drinking. He had addiction issues. I used to say, why are we not providing assistance to people who come out of corrections or the federal penitentiaries for addictions instead of throwing them back into the federal pen? That is not a treatment center and never will be. And I don't understand that. That's why I have a real issue with Section 810. I say that over and over, but anyways, I want to tie it into that story.
If I could though, Kim, if I can draw us
Yeah.
back, because we're using language that maybe not everyone's familiar with.
Okay.
So
Sorry.
Section 810 of the Criminal Code, is that a recognizance to keep the peace? Is that a document that's used? Is it fair to say that that document could be used in various ways? One could be to provide for protection of an individual. So if you're promising to keep the peace and you meet the conditions, then it arguably works to act as a sort of like a peace bond. Is that fair?
Well, yeah, that would be fair in one case, but what I find is that the police in particular are using it as a catch-all, like a net. It's much bigger. Its intended use wasn't for that. It was designed to look at really hardened criminals that were coming out of the system, child abusers, predators, those kind of people, rapists. It wasn't designed to do what the police departments across this country are using it for. And that's why I don't understand. I believe that, it's my opinion, but I believe that if it was ever a constitutional human rights issue, I don't think it would pass the test. And that's what I think. So I'm glad you cleared that up.
And well, one of the other things I'd like to clear up too is the use of conditions on any release documents, and you'd be familiar with this from your experience doing bail hearings, is the conditions that are included on any type of release document. If they're too onerous for an individual, is it fair to say they may not be able to meet those conditions? So for example, if you know someone is an addict or has an alcohol issue, if that provision's put in there, could one argue that that's set up to fail if they know they're not going to be able to meet it?
Yes, most of the conditions that are laid out by the Crown are set up to fail. And that's clearly one example. I mean, even some of the police officers that I dealt with would acknowledge that. They know that it's, I mean, if you're dealing with somebody has addiction issues of drinking, in terms, drugs, that kind of thing, there's no way they're gonna, and anybody who's, behind bars will sign anything to get out. So, because they believe at that moment of their life that they can overcome that issues, in terms of addiction. But it's a lot easier said than done. And so it sets up our people to fail within the system itself. And unfortunately, we have a lot of lawyers in this country and bureaucrats and justice people making lots of money off the backs of our people. And it's just getting worse. I'm hoping someday it'll change. Maybe it will, but yeah, anyways.
So One of the things that you do is you assist the members that are participating in Straight Up to provide advocacy. And you had told a story earlier when you said you had attended to court with the individual. And so is part of the role of Straight Up also in creating that family and the programming, the culturally relevant programming. One of the other things is advocacy. So does it help when you go to court with someone who's in the program? Does it help the justice system see that they're trying to be on the, I hate to use the word right track, but they're on a path in life that's recognizing the need to reconcile and to heal?
Yes, one thing I noticed about the, one good thing in terms of Straight Up as well is that the justice system or the court system does recognize the program and what we try to do and our vision. And a lot of times, Straight Up is the only program that's there advocating or offering support to that particular person who's before the courts. A lot of times families aren't there, and that's really tough. So yeah, we have a really solid reputation at this point in the community, and yeah, it's not anything that we were really proud of what we're doing in terms of our program in Saskatoon, and I'm really hoping that we can extend in terms of the whole country, even where that's my vision. But in terms of the court system itself, I really hope that someday that we have our own court system where the less serious crimes are moved within that process, where we as Indigenous people, we can look after our own people. We can address these issues, not somebody else that has no idea or the understanding of the struggles that Indigenous people go through in this country.
One of the things I understand the program to do too, by using a spiritual base or a program, I just want to make sure this is clear and on the record. The spiritual base doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be an Indigenous specific spiritual base, but that's one of the guiding principles. So there's a lot of room or inclusion of various faiths, if I understand.
Yes, that's correct. There are people who are Christian, people that come to our program, and of course, Indigenous people who are being introduced to their culture and spirituality, and so we accept people of all faiths. It's very important that they be heard as well and acknowledged, and that's one thing that we don't judge. Our program, we don't judge people. We don't judge anybody that comes through the door. That's really important to ensure that, because if we did, our program would not work out. Oh, I see.
I was just going to say, in terms of some of the cultural programming, I see a pictures up right now. Maybe you can describe some of the activities that are in the pictures we're seeing up with this, starting with this one.
Yes, that was a hoop dancer that we brought in. That's our cultural camp. That's our third one that we put together. One of the important components about our cultural camp, since we got everybody, like we have members and family, children there, that it's like a really important bonding experience, because a lot of times the families don't, they're set in an urban setting, for example, and all you hear is sirens and lights and all these kind of things. They don't get out to experience Mother Earth the way it is and the way it should be. This camp is very important for our members, and yeah, it's been a third year, so it's been, there's a fishing. Yeah, that's the guy there with the fishing rod, Gus. He's actually from a different country, and he's telling me that if it wasn't for Straight Up, he's told me this numerous times, he has no idea where he'd be today. So he looks at, and he's looking at participating in school. All these people always have plans. They have visions. They're like anybody. We all dream where we want to go and where we want to take our family. Oh yes, that was just a recent meeting. Mr. Bill Blair there, he's the Minister of Border Security. He was there. He wanted to come and see, talk to some of the members, hear some of the stories, and he said that he was highly recommended by the Public Safety Minister, Ralph Goodale, to come to the program. The person at the back there, that's Father Andre. He's the one of the founders of the program. And I was the one taking pictures.
Well, that's helpful. Just being mindful of time, I want to make sure that we haven't overlooked or missed anything in relation to the Straight Up program. I know that we talked briefly about if you had recommendations, what would they look like? And one of the things you had said earlier was when you develop this strategy, it would be nice to see it have more of a national component. You had talked about Saskatoon being one of these centers where you see a lot of Indigenous gangs and other gangs, but that the epicenter, I think is the way you've, and if I'm saying it wrong or misphrasing you, was Winnipeg. So we know that the gang issues are coming up in various provinces and territories in the country. Would one of your recommendations be better funding of these programs in various jurisdictions? You mentioned that you work on donation and that you get program or project funding. Would you agree that a good recommendation would be to increase funding, particularly from federal and territorial or provincial services, to address the rehabilitation of gang members or those exiting gangs?
Well, I certainly would agree with that 100%. One of the things that, I don't know if people are aware of this, but in Saskatchewan, in the budget last year under Justice, they had to come up with $9 million to put people in remand, to keep them there. They had to remove numerous programs within the correction system in Saskatoon that some of the people who went through would benefit. And they had no problem finding $9 million, yet it's a complete struggle to find a little bit of money for our program. And that shouldn't be that way. Federally, the federal government knows about what our program is all about. We've advocated with them. We've had meetings, those kind of things. And again, we're still waiting for a response. We've definitely put in proposals, under gang initiatives and justice initiatives. As of today, we haven't heard anything unless I don't think I got an email yet. We haven't heard anything yet. So, like I said it earlier, we talk about platitudes and gratitudes. Well, that's great. Let's see the rubber hit the road here.
One of the other things that you discussed was, it's difficult for the members in the program to leave. And so you have to create community for them. But would you agree with me a good recommendation would be to provide all, and I'm not talking gang members, all individuals leaving correction services better resources and opportunities for rehabilitation. So even if they're not gang members coming out of the correction system. So a phrase that we talked about is not in your testimony, but they go into custody and they become better criminals. Or that's where gang infiltration actually occurs for some Indigenous people, is actually in corrections. So, but even for those that don't become involved in the gangs, if they're leaving, as you suggested, out of the provincial institutes in Saskatchewan to live on a little more than $400 a month with, the baggage of not being able to get employment and all sorts of stuff, is it fair that a recommendation around ensuring that former inmates who have served their time succeed will be better contributing members to society if they have the proper resources?
Oh, absolutely. Sometimes I try to think out of the box. And one thing that I find is that, for example, our people, we're not being employed the way we should be. And a lot of times that, we struggle to get jobs, good quality paying full-time jobs. And that would actually alleviate a lot of the issues around, poverty and that. But that's what I find overall is that these big companies, corporations, some of them, they haven't picked up that responsibility of saying, let's include Indigenous people in this, in the economy. And I'll stress that, the economy. I find that we're forgotten about. I mean, they were debating here in Quebec here, you know, for the provincial election, and I never heard any mention about Indigenous issues at all. You know, so here you want to run what? There's no Indigenous people in Quebec? Like, I don't get it. I find that that's important, and what you indicated there is it would be a fair statement. I believe that in myself, the economy and employment is one of the things that is very important for our people. So yeah.
In the material that was provided to us, that you provided in relation to Straight Up, a history from despair to hope, there's a particular there's a particular reference right near the end on the conclusion that there's many paths towards healing, recovery, transformation, and conversion. The report also starts with like nothing's hopeless and that we need to focus on rehabilitation. Is it fair to make a recommendation that recognizes that rehabilitation is a process that's required for anyone either exiting gangs or not, in order for us as Indigenous people within communities to actually heal? We actually need to ensure that we're focusing on restorative methods instead of punitive ones.
That would be a really solid statement that I would agree with. Yeah, a lot of attention is paid to punitive. I remember I just did a quick add up the numbers, and well, for example, in Saskatchewan, it was like $1 billion towards the justice system itself in our tiny little province. And it gets bigger and bigger. I mean, we only have a little bit more than 1 million people, and yet they're forking out $1 billion, you know, under justice portfolio. When I say those kind of things, a lot of the justice officials get a little uncomfortable. But I mean, these are facts. They're not. I just don't. I keep wondering when it's going to end. Like, I don't say end, but what I mean is that, like, is it going to continue? Are we going to continue throwing money at the system that's just so broken for our people? You know, it's just a big, massive industry. I hear that all the time. It's just an industry, and it's unfortunate. And we, you know, in 1990, I think it was 96, I believe, 97. The Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples report, you know, had come out. I actually made a presentation to that commission at that time, and that report really, it just collected dust and still collects dust. I mean, I heard they, you know, pulled out little pieces of it lately, but I mean, we put all that money into it. Indigenous people in this country, they have the answers, they have the understanding, they know what's going on, they know how we can address these things, our people, and so it's important that, you know, that happens. But yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I agree with it.
Did you have any other further recommendations as it relates to either Straight Up or with your other hat on that you wanted the commissioners to know?
Yes, I want to touch a bit about GLADU. Of course, we know about the ruling. Well, maybe I shouldn't assume that, but I want to give a bit of my experience. I mean, I addressed the GLADU principles of the GLADU report, the Supreme Court ruling, a number of years ago. And what I found is that now that I'm sort of in the trenches and have been for the last number of years, particularly the last 2 years, is that the federal government has not stepped up to the plate and really taken a look at that, what that GLADU, what it meant to people, to particularly Indigenous people. In terms of the provinces, they haven't as well. I mean, in Saskatoon, I remember, or in Saskatchewan, they had released 20 reports, and that was it. Alberta's a bit further ahead. They're like sitting at about 800, well, maybe 100, a little under 900. British Columbia, certainly they're the ones that are leading the charge. As far as they seem to be the one that are further ahead. But I noticed the difference in British Columbia is that it's Indigenous people who've taken that leadership role in that area. And, but going back to that, what I'm finding about the Gladue thing is that a lot of people who are incarcerated or are within the justice system itself, Indigenous people, they don't even know what it is, what the Gladue is. They have no idea. One thing that I found is, for example, let's say anybody in the room here said, I want to advocate for somebody within the system. I want to write your Gladue report. I believe, I could do a good job. It wouldn't happen. A lot of the provinces would slam the door and say, no, you are not allowed to write anything. You can't advocate for this particular person because we have a process in place and we won't let you. And I find that kind of really unbelievable, but it's true. I've ran up against it myself. And I don't, again, I'm going to propose this, that Indigenous people, that we take over that process in terms of the Gladue, that it becomes a national sort of process, and that it's Indigenous people that play an integral role in the Gladue report writing, right down to the grassroots, right down to the moccasins. When you hit, I say walk in the moccasins, it should be our people doing that, not somebody like for example, a probation officer should not be writing Gladue on anybody. They're in a different position and they shouldn't be doing that. And one thing too about Gladue is that I fully believe that Indigenous people, they can move that the story forward more than somebody who doesn't know who they are, doesn't understand where they're coming from. It's Indigenous people that can understand that. And so that's why that's really important in terms of Gladue.
Can I ask just one question
Sure.
in relation to when you were presiding level 2 JP and did bail hearings? Did you have Indigenous accused before you for bail?
I did, and not once did Gladue ever come up. Not even once. I can, matter of fact, my understanding is that based on the bails that are put before, a lot of times that's not even considered. It's mostly considered in sentencing. And people think that it's one thing too about that I'm finding is that a lot of people, well, particularly in the justice system, the officials and that, they seem to think that it's some kind of a get out of jail card, and it's not. But they do, and they think, oh, we'll just get out of jail for something. No, it's not like that.
So if I can follow up on that last question. So when you were presiding, if you had an Aboriginal accused before you, the defense or Crown would not raise any issues of Gladue as it would relate to bail?
Never.
Would you agree with me that in Canada, it's law that Gladue is considered at the bail stage for Aboriginal people?
I would agree 100%, yes.
Okay. And I want to make sure, please correct me if I'm saying this wrong, because I want to make sure I'm characterizing it right. So what I'm hearing from you, though, is it seems like the Gladue is not being appropriately applied. Are you characterizing the fact that Gladue is not being appropriately applied to take into account all of the issues from Indigenous perspective? Is that a fair?
That would be a fair statement.
Okay.
The other thing too that's come up is, the provinces are using the costs as a barrier. We've heard numbers thrown around like, $2,500 to $10,000 for a Gladue report. Well, in Alberta, for example, they max out at $1,500. That's it. And they don't go any further than that. There's a little bit of money they throw in, if you have to drive somewhere to have a meeting or, buy some coffee or something, but that's the extent of it. And so I don't know where, that's coming from there. I know their budget is about $1 million in Alberta. So yeah, those are just some of the examples. And when it comes to bail, nope, not at all.
So is it fair, and would you agree with me, one of the recommendations, if I'm understanding what you've said properly, one of the recommendations you would make would be to empower Indigenous organizations or people to do the report writing or groundwork for Gladu reports in
Yeah.
Saskatchewan and other places?
Yes, I would agree 100% for that, to empower our people to do that.
Okay, so, and just, I believe that I've covered off most of the questions I have for you, but I always like to afford the opportunity, in case I've missed anything, for you to, if you have any final or other points that you wanted to raise or make a recommendation on.
I think I'm good.
You're good?
Yeah.
You're good. Chief Commissioner, oh, oui, c'est ça.
Merci beaucoup. Maître Michael, principal.
The microphone is not quite on yet. Her microphone is not working. Yep, the microphone is not really working yet.
Who are listening right now, and many Indigenous people who are not aware, like you mentioned, Mr. Bernard earlier, what is the plan in a few seconds, please?
Certainly. Yes. And with permission of the commissioners, I'm going to lead it so that I can get agreement on record and maybe through the principal quicker.
Please,
Yes,
go ahead.
Thank you. Okay. So, Kim, you were talking about the Supreme Court decision. Is it true there was a Supreme Court decision? It was called Regina and Gladu. And essentially, and please feel free to add if I'm not correct in sort of adducing this, the court at the time had made a decision, the Supreme Court, that as it applies to Aboriginal offenders, so people convicted of an offense, that there were certain factors that needed to be taken into consideration. Is that a fair assessment? Would you agree that some of those factors that a court must look at in sentencing Aboriginal offenders include things like their background, so the history of systemic discrimination, the impact of colonial legacy like the residential schools or the disenfranchisement of people taken from their community, much like the Michelle Band? Are those the types of factors that courts are supposed to take into consideration when they're sentencing an Aboriginal person?
Yes. In a lot of ways too, it's sort of the same principles that we apply when it comes to our program at Straight Up. We ask how you, like, go back as far as you can go back in terms of your family history and what has transpired to where you are today. And that's sort of what those reports should encompass when they're doing Gladu. And because it's important. I mean, if you're struggling with addictions, if you're struggling with poverty, broken families, those kind of things. What if you're what if you're a 60s scoop person? What if you've been, you were part of that? I mean, I've run into people that have been, and it's a huge struggle. They get caught up in that system because they don't understand what happened and who they were. The court needs to know that. They need to know that, I just didn't wake up in the morning and say, well, I'm going to go, rob somebody or take their car or whatever. It does not happen that way. And so it gets for them to understand where they were and how they got there is very important, even to where they're going, to offer hope to them as well. in terms of the report itself. What can we do? There's recommendations within GLADU where they say, well, you know, with respect to a report that, oh, we didn't realize that the person is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. How can we get that person help? Or they were sexually abused when they were children and they never really formally dealt with it. Instead, they, you know, drank, or, you know, they did drugs and that kind of stuff. That's how they dealt with the pain. Those are the things that should be within that report. And those are the things that the court should hear. And that's very, very important.
And that leads me to my next, because right here we're doing a lot of generalizations, and I think it's important to note for the record, we're just trying to establish some key principles. So along with those key principles, would you agree that one part of the GLADU decision was to recognize and look at those factors, but another really important part of the GLADU case was to ensure that sentencing was appropriate in the circumstances of the offender. And so when you talk about the report, so first of all, do you agree with the first point that the second part of the GLADU decision was to ensure appropriate sentencing?
Yes, I agree. Yes.
And then the next part is you were talking about reports. So reports aren't actually directed out of the GLADU decision, but they evolve over time because it's already been, I believe, 18 years since that decision. And so essentially, there's been new law that also supports what the court found in GLADU. One of the things that has developed and now has been spoken about in IPELI, which was a case from 2012, was the need for reports. And so the reports you're talking about, those are written to help inform the court about those factors and what appropriate sentences would be. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree. Yes.
And so when you make a recommendation in relation to the reports or that process being primarily held in the hands of Aboriginal authors, is it that you believe that they will be able to contextualize the factors that impact the circumstances of an offender and the potential possibility for rehabilitation and appropriate sentences? They may be better situated to do that with their knowledge and experience.
Yes, well, one thing I believe is that, you know, as Indigenous people, we can talk to other Indigenous people. And a lot of times we're sharing stories. So there's a trust element there as well. Like if you're going to write a GLADU and you're going to talk to a non-Indigenous person, how comfortable are you if you're going to tell that person that, you know, that you were sexually abused when you were younger and the effect that it had on you as a person? You're not going to be that comfortable doing it. Where I feel that as a, you know, if that person knows that you're on their side and you're going to articulate that and put that in the report, because that's important, that you're their voice. And so by putting that, that's why I believe that it should be Indigenous people doing these reports. Now, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. If I walked away from anything, that'd be the number one thing. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Kim. Those are the questions that I have in my examination in chief. I'm aware of the time, it's almost 12, so I'm going to request that we have a 1-hour lunch break, but I'm also going to ask that the parties withstanding at the beginning of the break, please meet us in the Dufferin room for the purposes of the cross-examination verification. And if we can commence sharp at 1, just keeping in mind that the Honorable Kim Bowden has a hard deadline of 5 p.m. to leave.
Thank you. Before we take the break, I'll direct Mr. Registrar to redact any personal contact information on the CV for Mr. Baudin, Exhibit 20, and we'll reconvene at 1 o'clock.
And I apologize. Can I also have made, when you gave that instruction to the registrar, it reminded me that for the purposes of my colleagues being able to ask questions, can we please have the document entitled Straight Up, A History from Despair to Hope, made an exhibit?
Yes, Straight Up, A History from Despair to Hope will be Exhibit 21, please.
Thank you very much. On the lunch
break.